There's a word that gets used a lot in politics and economics. Temporary. It's supposed to be reassuring. A signal that something uncomfortable is happening, but it won't last. Just hold on. Things will return to normal soon. Except sometimes they don't. And sometimes nobody tells you when temporary became permanent. They just stop talking about it. Stop mentioning the timeline. Stop updating the projections. And at some point you're supposed to stop asking. This is about one of those times. In early 2021, prices started rising. Not everywhere, not dramatically at first, but noticeably. Gas went up. Groceries cost more. Rent increases accelerated. Used cars became absurdly expensive. Officials said it was temporary. Supply chains were disrupted because of the pandemic. Factories had shut down. Shipping was delayed. Demand had surged as the economy reopened. Once everything normalized, prices would stabilize. That made sense. Temporary disruption. Temporary price increases. Logical. The Federal Reserve called it transitory. That was the word, transitory. It appeared in official statements, press conferences, policy briefings. Inflation is transitory, meaning it would pass, meaning it wasn't structural, meaning don't worry. So people waited. Months went by. Prices kept rising. The word transitory kept appearing. Fed officials repeated it. Treasury officials echoed it. Economists used it. The message was consistent. This is a short-term issue caused by unusual circumstances. Once supply catches up with demand, inflation will moderate. But when would that happen? The answer kept changing. At first it was a few months. By summer, officials were saying maybe by year-end. Then early next year. Then sometime next year. The timeline stretched. Quietly, without announcement. Just gradual shifts in language during routine press briefings that most people didn't watch. And at some point, the word transitory disappeared. Not with an apology, not with a correction. It just stopped being used. Officials stopped saying inflation was temporary. They started saying inflation was elevated but moderating. Then they said it was stabilizing. Then they stopped characterizing it at all and just reported the numbers. The promise of temporary became the acceptance of ongoing. Here's what that looked like in practice. In mid-2021, inflation was running at about 5% high, but officials said it would drop back to 2% soon. By late 2021, it was 6%, then 7%. By mid-2022, 9%. At no point did anyone come out and say we were wrong. This isn't temporary. We need to revise our assessment. Instead, the framing changed. Officials stopped saying inflation would return to normal and started saying they were committed to bringing it back down. See the difference? One suggests it will happen naturally. The other admits it requires intervention, but they never acknowledged the shift. They just quietly moved from one position to the other, and the public was expected to not notice, or not care, or forget what was promised. By 2023, inflation had moderated. It dropped from 9% to around 4%. Then 3%. Officials declared progress. The worst was over. The situation was improving. But here's what didn't happen. Prices didn't go back down. They stopped rising as fast. That's not the same thing. If something cost $10 in 2020 and $15 in 2022, it didn't go back to 10 when inflation moderated. It stayed at 15. Maybe it went to 16 instead of 18. And that was considered progress. So when officials said inflation was under control, what they meant was, things are still expensive, but they're getting expensive slower. That's not temporary. That's permanent with a slower growth rate. And nobody corrected that framing. Think about what temporary means. If your rent goes up temporarily, it goes back down. If prices rise temporarily, they decrease afterward. That's what temporary means. But that's not what happened. Costs went up. Then they stopped going up as fast. Then everyone moved on. The burden of that difference fell on ordinary people, because wages didn't rise as fast as prices did, so purchasing power decreased. And when inflation moderated, wages didn't suddenly jump to compensate for what was lost. People just had less, and they adjusted, bought cheaper groceries, delayed purchases, cut back on discretionary spending. That became the new normal, which is fine if you call it that. If you say prices rose, they're not coming back down. People will have to adapt. That's honest. That's clear. But that's not what was said was temporary. What was delivered was permanent adjustment. And here's the thing. Nobody fought this. Allies didn't push back. Progressive economists who usually critique these things stayed relatively quiet. Labor unions didn't organize mass action. Political opponents complained, but not about the framing, just about who was in charge when it happened. Meaning the only real disagreement was about blame, not about the underlying acceptance that this is just how things are now. That silence is the story, because if this were truly unacceptable, there would be sustained pressure to reverse it. There would be demands that corporations lower prices now that supply chains have normalized. There would be calls for rent reductions now that the temporary disruption has ended. But that didn't happen, because everyone quietly accepted that temporary was a word used to manage expectations, not describe reality. Officials knew this. They had to, because when inflation first spiked, there were policy tools available. The Federal Reserve could have raised interest rates immediately and aggressively. The government could have implemented temporary price controls on essential goods. Congress could have passed relief measures to offset increased costs. Some of those things happened, but slowly, hesitantly, only after it became undeniable that prices weren't dropping on their own. And by then, it was too late to prevent the permanent shift. The goal became damage control, not reversal. So what was described as a short-term spike became a long-term recalibration of what things cost, and everyone just sort of accepted it. Not because they agreed it was right, because fighting it felt futile. When officials say something is temporary, there's an implied promise: you won't have to endure this forever, just a little longer, just until things normalize. But when temporary stretches indefinitely, and normalization means accepting the new higher baseline, that promise breaks. And when it breaks without acknowledgement, people stop trusting the next time they're told to wait it out. That's the real cost, not the dollars and cents, though those matter. The cost is the quiet realization that temporary is a word used to buy time while everyone adjusts to permanent. And the next time something gets called temporary, a policy, a measure, a disruption, people will remember. They'll remember that temporary lasted years, that timelines shifted without explanation, that the burden of adjustment fell on them, not on the institutions that caused or failed to prevent the problem. They'll remember that nobody apologized, nobody corrected the record, and nobody seemed particularly concerned that promises weren't kept. Because the expectation wasn't that officials would fix it, the expectation was that people would stop complaining, and mostly they did. Not because the problem was solved, because exhaustion set in, because outrage is hard to sustain when the response is silence, because eventually you have to buy groceries regardless of how much they cost. So you adjust, you make it work, you stop expecting things to go back to how they were, you accept the new baseline. That's what officials were counting on, not that people would agree, that they would adapt. And they were right, which is why this will happen again. Not the same issue necessarily, but the same pattern. Something will go wrong, officials will call it temporary, timelines will silence will replace explanations, and the burden will fall on people who have no choice but to absorb it. And the word temporary will be used again, even though everyone will know what it actually means by then. It means this is happening, and it's not going away, but we need you to not panic while we figure out what to do, or don't do, or do halfway. Temporary doesn't mean short-term anymore. It means indefinite, with optimistic framing. And once you hear it that way, you can't unhear it. The next time a government official or central banker or economist tells you something is temporary, listen to what they're actually saying. They're not telling you it will end. They're telling you to endure it until they stop talking about it. That's not reassurance, that's management. And now you know the difference.